Good advice from a former investor. Francis Byrd has been around the block. I've known him a long time. He's currently managing partner of his own firm, Alchemy Strategies Partners, but he brings a wealth of experience to the table for his clients because he's been with three different investors: TIAA, the state of Connecticut, and New York City Comptroller's office with the New York City pension funds. And he's been with the rating agency Moody's doing governance work today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. So, Francis, you've been doing this a long time. You definitely know the investor perspective of things. And of course, things keep moving at lightning speed, changing all the time. Literally, almost it seems from week to week, month to month, not even year to year anymore. So, for my first question for you is, engagement seems to be the watchword for relationships between investors and companies. How should companies view the necessity of engaging with investors these days compared to even just a year or two ago?
Well, thank you for the interview, but let me respond to your question. I think that companies are often a little bit afraid, and their legal counsel and their outside counsel are a little afraid too of sitting down and talking to investors, particularly when investors are asking to speak to directors. They get very, very concerned about that. So I think the first thing is to try and understand what the issues are that the investor wants to talk about before you even get into, who should reach out and who should be in the meeting. Should be, do you understand what those issues are? Are there compensation concerns? Is it a performance concern? Because it's not going to be your standard investor relations presentation. It's going to be more like a conversation with someone who is knowledgeable about the company. So first, try to understand that. Second, don't come in with a set of notions about who the investors are and what the investors know and what the investors know about the company. So in the early days, and I'd been with both the New York City Employees Retirement System and with the state of Connecticut, doing engagement for those funds and at TIAA. The presumption would be from companies that the folks at TIAA likely knew what they were talking about, but that the folks from New York City and from state of Connecticut wouldn't know anything about the company, wouldn't have any idea, and that they, just were concerned about a cause or some sort of political thing. So they were always surprised when we would say, when the trustees would say, hey, we really want to know about, this spot here where you didn't perform. We want to know about what happened with this division. Why was this a problem for you? What happened in the Asian market? Blah, 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 blah. And they'd always go, well, we weren't expecting those questions, even though in the pre-meeting, and we'll talk about pre-meetings a little later, I guess, I would tell them, be prepared for questions about performance, questions about management, but they still weren't. They still expected that it was going to be some sort of quasi-political discussion. So don't presume that you know that certain investors aren't going to ask performance questions, aren't going to ask questions about succession planning, aren't going to ask questions about board operations. Don't presume that you already know what the investor thinks. So that's the next thing. One is understand your context, understand the investor's context. Next, set some ground rules in your early discussions before you have, we're talking right now about basically war in Israel, Gaza, but diplomacy usually is not between the two principals, but it's usually between folks further down in the foreign ministry or the State Department who have conversations about the conversation that will happen. So if you're an inside counsel or you're an outside counsel representing an issuer, then you're that foreign ministry or State Department official who's trying to put together the guidelines and the guardrails for the conversation that your directors, your CEO are going to have with the investors, which means, what are we going to be talking about? What issues are off topic? What issues are on topic? So you need to help craft that. The investor, of course, has things that they want to discuss. You want to find out what those are and whether they're safe to discuss. And then you bring that back to the company, you bring that back to your CEO, your directors, and that's when you can craft your answers and protect them from disclosing any material non-public information. So that's your opportunity to find out what the investors want to talk about. And if something comes out of left field during the course of the conversation or the meeting, you can say, oh, we either agreed not to discuss that, or that didn't come up in our pre-meeting. We're not prepared to answer at this time. And it's a legitimate way of protecting your CEO, senior management, and the board from those questions that may not be safe to answer.
Great stuff. So top topic today, and perhaps for the rest of our lifetime, is ESG, particularly climate, but also, of course, social. And companies feel under pressure to develop their programs, and all sorts of political things happening around ESG right now in the United States. But in the disclosure area, of course, some rules are starting to pop up. California enacted something last week. The CSRD in Europe will be taking effect next year, and then we should see final SEC rules adopted soon enough that the effective date we don't know yet will happen. So how might lawyers respond to boards or senior management requesting guidance about how to develop a program?
Well, that's a great question. So firstly, I think they need to identify and determine what the company has already been doing in that specific area around both the disclosure and around the company's practice, so that they can figure out whether they're going to be in compliance with disclosure rules or not be in compliance with disclosure rules, and then what they need to do to sort of catch up. The next thing is to benchmark what the practices are of your competitors in your sector, in your industry, so that you know whether you're ahead of them in terms of disclosure, ahead of them in terms of practice, or are you on par with them, or are you behind your peers? Because investors, as they want to talk with you and as you speak with them, may be asking questions about why are you behind XYZ? XYZ isn't a leader, but you're behind them. They're lagging and you're lagging even further. Why is that? So you need to at least know where you are, relatively speaking, in terms of disclosure and performance, so that you are in a better position to figure out what you need to do. That's firstly. After you've determined some of that, the next question for senior management to take to the board is, what will it take to catch up? If you happen to be lagging, or if you really haven't focused on this area at all, and you're starting to now, the question is going to be, well, what will it take to get there? I haven't met a CEO or a management team, or a board for that matter, who is happy to play on a last place company, happy to play on a last place team. Everyone wants to do their best and be their best. So the question is going to be, what will it take? Can we play in this area? Can we actually perform up to or surpass peers? And what will it cost to do that? Is it prohibitively expensive to try and do this? Are we forced to remain a laggard because we just can't do this in terms of employee time and in terms of treasure? Or is this something that we can do? There'll be a cost. Can we meet it? So helping senior management make that determination, and then the presentation to the board about what it is that they will do. Obviously, the CEO will lead that, but he's going to be leading that with information that you provide him with about where you are relative to peers and whether it's affordable for you to be able to go ahead and meet that challenge.
Great stuff again. So in my career, I was at a law firm and at the SEC before I worked in-house. So I really had no clue about how a company's investor relations program worked. And it's presumed to be a solid sword and shield for a company. So what role should outside counsel play in helping the company develop their IR program?
Well, as I understand it, and I haven't worked directly for a company in investor relations, but I have experience from two proxy solicitation firms working with folks in IR and general counsel's offices on these issues. And I think that the primary thing is to make sure that, one, everything is appropriate in terms of the disclosure, that you're meeting the requirements, that you're not necessarily exceeding those requirements, and then that you're not disclosing any material non-public information. So those would be the three. But the other is to, in terms of the IR program, be a little more cutting edge and try to understand not just the folks on the buy side and the sell side, but there's another side too. You could call them the governance side, or you could call them the ESG side or the proxy voting side, whatever terminology you find most helpful to understanding that these are the folks who are going to be voting the proxies, determining which shareholder initiatives to support from other investors or to initiate. And those folks require a little different information than, say, folks are on the buy or the sell side with whom you normally deal. They are going to be looking for information about the directors, information about how the board works. So legal counsel and IR need to sort of work together on what story do we want to tell about our board? What story do we want to tell about how that board operates, the experience it brings, the institutional memory it has, if it's a long-serving board and there hasn't been a lot of turnover or fresh directors having been brought in. So you need to think through from that perspective, that investor perspective, not just whether or not, in essence, you can pitch the stock to a particular investor.
So you mentioned pre-meeting, but let's talk about a pre-meeting in the context of investor requesting a meeting with senior management, maybe the CEO and or one or more board members. What would be the best practice for planning and prepping for such a meeting?
Well, the investors likely made outreach to you. Either they've filed a shareholder proposal or they've placed a call. They may have sent a letter if it's an activist investor talking about performance. So it's to determine, as I said before, what does the investor want? Who is the investor? How is the investor voted? Do they have a history of either activism? Do they have a history of ESG initiatives? So you would treat a response from a small activist a little differently than you would from, say, the New York City Comptroller's office on behalf of the New York City retirement systems and pension funds. So knowing who that investor is going to be very, very important. Next, who do they want at the meeting? You need to find out what their demand for the meeting is. Do they want the CEO? Do they want a director as well? Do they want a CEO and then to speak to a director, or the other way around? So figuring out who they want to speak with, that's important. And then setting out the guideposts for the conversation. What will the conversation be about? What's not on the agenda for discussion, so that there's a pretty tight agenda. One, because, and you can obviously say this legitimately, people just don't have time. They don't have time for a sort of fishing expedition conversation. They need to know really what it is that you want, how you want it, when you want it. And so you need to be able to have those in a series of tight questions so that you can tell senior management, here's what this meeting is going to be about. If it's going to be the CEO or the CFO, obviously you may want to make a presentation. I've been, in my career, part of many meetings where, when I was representing public pension funds, where the company would come in, I would tell them, don't bring your IR guy. we don't need that story. We have these questions. We're concerned about the classified board. We're concerned about the composition of the board. Let's just talk about that. And they would come in, they bring in the IR guy who would want to start the standard presentation. Clearly, there was no real conversation and follow-up. Whoever I spoke to at the company didn't pay attention to anything that I said. That was always disappointing. And the trustees would be very angry about that. So you need to try and avoid circumstances where you're not listening to what the investor says in your pre-conversation. But if you do listen and you can arrive at, here's what we're going to discuss. We'll discuss the classified board. We'll discuss board succession planning. We will discuss briefly performance. We'll discuss the role of the board in the CEO succession process and in the planning process, the strategic planning process. So here's what we're going to discuss. And the investor says, yeah, great. That sounds perfect. That's really what we want to know. And then you can have the meeting. There will be subsidiary questions from that and follow-up questions from that. But at least you know what the outline of the questions are.
What about a situation where you may or may not know an investor's true motivation for activism? ESG might ostensibly be the reason an investor has become an activist towards your company, but maybe they're really interested in making money. How can a company handle sort of a mixed message or an unknown motivation? I don't know if you understand the question, but I think you do.
Yeah. So if you're afraid that you're meeting with a wolf in sheep's clothing or a sheep in wolf's clothing, one out of the two or both, but that's why I talk about knowing who the investor is. So you need to do the backgrounds research. You need to speak with your solicitor and get as much information as you can about the particular investor so that you have a much better idea of who they are, what their record is, what they've asked about. I guess Engine One sort of comes to mind because much was talked about that being ExxonMobil being an ESG play, that it was really all about ESG. I didn't quite believe that. I believe that there was some overlay of ESG, but it was really about performance. It was really about ExxonMobil's performance at the time. And board members from that Engine One group are on, and we find ourselves a few years later from Engine One's proxy contest. And guess what? They are in the process of having announced the purchase of a shale oil driller. Now, who would have thought that? You would have thought, well, no, they're not going to do that. They'll be divesting from fossil fuels. Instead, they are committing to making a fossil fuel purchase. So what that sort of says to me from the outside is these guys were interested, the people who came on were interested in making money. Yes, they're interested in ESG, they're interested in clean energy, but they're also interested in the company taking advantage of opportunities to make money within an industry that it knows and understands. And they're not necessarily going to get in the way of a deal if they feel that that deal is going to be accretive to shareholders. So you need to think through, is it really about ESG? Is it really about something that's political? Is it really about political contributions? Is it really about whether or not the company is going to reimburse employees for reproductive health care? Or is this really about money ultimately? Because it usually is really about money ultimately. But to do that, you need to sort of figure out and research who the investor really is and what their track record is, to the extent that they have a public track record out there.
Well, Francis, I've known you for a very long time through all your permutations of I mean, you have a mix of experience that I don't think anyone else can match. So between working at 3 investors and 2 proxy solicitors, you truly have seen it all. And thank you so much for bringing that wealth of experience and knowledge to our audience.
And one credit rating agency. Don't want to forget
Truly,
about.
truly unique. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.